Welcome to this event, to NYU and to the College of Arts and Sciences, which is hosting us tonight. My name is Jill Lang, and I'm the director for the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And we're especially pleased to have you here to join us in the first of what we hope will be many events in which we explore the implications for Latin America, for the region, in all its complexities of this new moment of the Trump presidency and all that that will entail. And we are especially pleased to start that reflection tonight with three very distinguished guests whom I will introduce. They will, so you have a sense of the format here tonight, they will speak for a time, and there will be an opportunity for Q&A, question and answer at a certain point, and I imagine many of you will have a lot of questions on this topic. Let me introduce our guests so you have a sense of the expertise that they bring to this conversation. Jorge Castañeda, to my immediate right, is a renowned public intellectual, political scientist, prolific writer with an interest in Latin American politics, comparative politics, and U.S.-Latin America relations. He was Foreign Minister of Mexico from 2000 to 2003, and in that position focused on diverse issues in U.S.-Mexican relations, including migration, trade, security, and narcotics control, joint diplomatic initiatives on the part of Latin American nations, and the promotion of Mexican economic and trade relations globally. Dr. Castañeda has taught at Mexico's National Autonomous University, the UNAM, at Princeton and UC Berkeley, and is now Global Distinguished Professor of Politics and Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at NYU. Dr. Castañeda was Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, was a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Research and Writing Grant recipient. He is a member of the board of Human Rights Watch, and since 2003 here at NYU has hosted Voices of Latin American Leaders. And we consider this in some ways part of that series. A prolific author, I'll list only a few of the titles of Professor Castañeda's recent work. So among those works are Limits to Friendship, The United States and Mexico, written with Robert Pastor, Utopia Unarmed, the Latin America, this is not written properly.
I think we can dispense with all of that.
Okay, and most recently, Mañana Forever, Mexico and the Mexicans. And welcome and thank you, Dr. Castañeda. John Coatsworth is a leading scholar of Latin American economic and international history, and served as Dean of the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia for 4 years before being named Provost of Columbia University in 2012. He previously served as the Monroe Gutman Professor of Latin American Affairs at Harvard University, where he was the founding director of Harvard's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and chair of the Harvard University Committee on Human Rights Studies. His most recent book is Living Standards in Latin American History, Height, Welfare, and Development from 1750 to 2000, edited with Ricardo Salvatore and Amilcar Chayu. And Professor Coatsworth similarly has a long bibliography of books, which you will trust me that it is there. Arturo Valenzuela is Senior Advisor for Latin America based in Washington, D.C. Dr. Valenzuela is a highly regarded diplomat, scholar, and international business consultant. He provides strategic advice, risk assessment, and consulting services to U.S. and international clients with investments and operations in Latin America, and Latin American clients interested in expanding their operations overseas. Prior to, Dr. Valenzuela was Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs in the U.S. Department of State in the first Obama administration, and in that position he was responsible for the formulation, execution, and management of U.S. policy toward the countries of the Americas. During President Clinton's second term, he served as the White House Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Inter-American Affairs at the National Security Council. As you can see, we have three very distinguished guests. We'll get right to their presentations. Join me in welcoming them here.
Thank you, Jill. So I'll start off strictly alphabetical order. The idea we have is to perhaps each one of us speak 6 or 7 minutes, then perhaps comment or discuss or disagree with what each one of us says for another 15 or 20 minutes, and then open it up to questions from you on the issues we will have discussed, or any issue you'd like to bring up. My take so far on the implications of Trump's victory for Mexico and Latin America are very, very, very pessimistic. I think certainly for Mexico this is an unmitigated disaster. I think it will be very harmful to the country, very damaging to the country, because I am convinced that while he will not do everything he promised to do during the campaign, he will have to do some of the things he promised to do during the campaign. That's the way this works. You can't just say things and have people get all excited about them. Your followers, of course, not the other guy's followers, in this case the other person's followers, and then just make believe that you never said anything. You have to end up doing some of the things that you promised to do, because you have electorates who are expecting that of you. As I say, they might not expect you to do everything right away, but they do expect you to do some things relatively soon. So on the main issues for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, I think the situation in South America is perhaps different. On the 3 or 4 main issues, I think that Trump will do some of the things he promised, and that they will be very damaging, very harmful to these countries. On trade, I do believe that he will try to either renegotiate or depart from NAFTA, which has never been as great as it was set up to be. But given now that it's been the framework for US-Mexican trade and investment for 22 years, reopening it, renegotiating it, having a period, an interval during which the rules will not be clear, I think could be very harmful for Mexico, particularly as regards investment. This could also, by the way, be true, though less so, for the so-called CAFTA-DR agreement with Central America and the Dominican Republic on trade. And I think that the Mexican government, as well as the Central American governments and Dominican Republic, should say no renegotiation, no reopening. And I am not a great defender of NAFTA. I wasn't then, and I'm still not now. But this is what we have. So I think the position should be no. If you want to leave, leave. If you want to renegotiate, you want to negotiate side agreements on issues that are important to you and that do not contradict the agreement, that's fine. And that's a little bit what Arturo and others did in 1993 when Clinton was elected, and they negotiated side agreements. On mass deportations, I also think that some of what he has threatened to do, he will do. He will not deport 12 million undocumented people overnight, granted. He could deport a lot of people over the first few months. And I think the best proof we have that he can do this is that Obama did it. Obama, as you know, deported more people than any other president in the history of the United States, even more than during Operation Wetback back in the early 50s, although granted there were fewer people in the United States. That's also true. If Obama, who ran on a pro-immigration reform platform, who wanted immigration reform, who made a serious effort to do it, deported 2.5 million undocumented people, perhaps 1.5 million Mexicans, why shouldn't Trump deport at least as many? And a bit more. He said he did. Obama said he wouldn't, and he did. This guy says he will, so he will. And I think, again, what the Mexicans and the Central Americans should do is, we're going to fight this. We're going to do everything we can to stop this from happening. We're going to do what we can to make it very difficult for him to deport people, to sort of, I would say, congest the system a little bit, what the California state legislature just approved a couple of days ago, 3 or 4 days ago. Significant amount of money to pay for lawyers, social workers, other people to help all of those potential deportees who want to go to a hearing, where the chances of winning the hearing rise dramatically if you have a lawyer. Mexico can do the same thing, and Mexico can also do a similar thing in terms of requesting that the United States prove that the people it wants to deport to Mexico are Mexicans, and that those that it wants to deport to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are citizens of those countries. And finally, on the wall, perhaps it's the most symbolic one, and it's the least important one, but it's also perhaps the one which is most unpleasant, which is most unfriendly, which is most hostile. There are already about 700 miles of wall in the 2,000-mile border. There's no particularly good reason why he can't add on another 700 or so, because that's what his predecessors did. Clinton, Bush, and Obama. All three of them built walls. The question, frankly, of who pays for it is, I think, absolutely irrelevant. I think it's a very stupid statement by the Mexican government to say, and the Mexican president, we won't pay for the wall. Who cares? That's not the issue. The issue is whether there is a wall or not a wall. And I think Mexico should be very forceful, like the president of Peru has been, and like former presidents of Chile and other places have been, saying, we are against the wall, and we will do everything we can for there to be no wall. If we win, we win, and if we lose, we lose, but at least we tried. And I think that's what we should do in the coming months. Have serious doubts, though, as to that being what we will do. Thank you. John.
Thanks, Jorge. And thanks to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for providing me for an excuse to come down to the much more interesting part of the city. It's a pleasure to be here. I should say, I guess to start, that nothing that I say should be taken as a position of Columbia University. So I'm not speaking for Columbia, but just for myself. I think I take a somewhat more cheerful approach to the topic of that we're discussing this evening. I think Donald Trump has been the most entertaining candidate and president-elect in my lifetime. Most of my colleagues don't find him entertaining at all. But I think it's just been a wonderful show from beginning to end. He has said some outrageous things. When he's called on false statements and terrible sentiments, he just sort of doubles down on them. He's just a walking bundle of interesting things. So I guess I should start by saying that there is good news, or maybe it's bad news, but I think it's good news. And the news is that no one in Trump's inner circle, no one that he's appointed to a national security post, no one that he's appointed to a post related to defense or foreign affairs, knows very much about Latin America or has ever been there for a very long time. Most of the periods of good relations between Latin America and the United States have been periods during which policy has been managed by the people like Arturo Valenzuela and professionals who know the region with as little interference from the White House as possible, and that looks like that may be the case in the coming administration. There's just absolutely nothing that can happen in Latin America, with two exceptions, that would be of interest to President Trump or to most of the people that he's appointed. And this, I think, is in general is good news. Let me make just 3 quick points. The first is that nothing that we say should be taken seriously. It's virtually impossible to predict from what we know now what a Trump administration is going to look like in domestic or in foreign policy. So the first point I want to make is that we just don't know. Trump has said a whole series of things about how he wants to change the direction of American foreign policy, to shift back toward a more pro-Russian stance and a more anti-Chinese stance. We've been playing this game for decades and decades. First we balanced toward the Russians, and then we balanced toward the Chinese. And the idea is, in the long run, that balancing them off will produce a peaceful world. I'm not quite sure that's true, but it really is an interesting phenomenon that American policy will tilt toward Russia at a time when Western Europe is in disarray. So a world in which the three great powers are China, Russia, and the US, with the US trying to balance the other two, and the other two trying to balance against us, should prove to be a very interesting period in American foreign policy, but one in which, for Latin America, it's impossible to predict what the consequences will be. If we tilt toward Russia, maybe that means the Russians will give up their idea of recreating a naval base in Cuba. Maybe not. If we tilt toward Russia, maybe the Chinese will start using their enormous economic influence in Latin America, tempered somewhat by the commodity bust that occurred as a consequence of the financial crisis and other issues. Perhaps the Chinese will begin being much more aggressive in the way that they cultivate Latin American politicians and interest groups, but we just don't know. Maybe if they do, it will have no consequence whatsoever for American policy. Maybe the Russians will if we are successful in our efforts if Trump is successful in his efforts to make them more cooperative, they will help us in Latin America against the Chinese. I mean, these are all very strange questions to be asking or to be posing at the beginning of an American administration. We just simply don't know what Trump's geopolitical strategy will be and what its consequences might be for Latin America. And we certainly don't know what the consequences will be of his really frontal assault on the defense and intelligence establishment of the country that's been running the place with a pretty much a free hand, except for the constraints imposed on it by President Obama for quite a long time. So my first point is, don't trust us. We simply don't know. Second point is, Latin America will not be a top Trump priority, except to the extent that Latin Americans are of interest to his domestic focus. Like most first-term presidents, Trump is likely to focus on domestic policy and leave foreign policy to others, to a rather strange group of others, I must say. But in any case, he's likely to focus domestically. That means that unless Latin America poses a domestic issue that Trump feels he has to address, he's likely to ignore the place, which is, given what little he has said, probably a good thing rather than a bad thing. The third point I want to make is that if there are any flashpoints, therefore, likely to occur in American policy toward Latin America over the next 4 years, they are likely to be focused on countries and on issues that have domestic political resonance. So that means Cuba and Mexico. Cuba, basically because the Florida Republicans are still anchored in the 1950s and have criticized Obama's opening to Cuba and the recognition of the diplomatic relations with Cuba. So Trump may feel under some pressure to do something about Cuba, but in a particularly delicate moment in Cuban history. The potential for destructive behavior on the part of the American administration, I think, has never been greater. And destructive behavior that could derail, or at the very least make much more complicated, Cuba's peaceful and so far reasonably successful transition to a different kind of society and politics. So I think Cuba is likely to be a flashpoint, and it's a point at which the Trump policy could be quite damaging and destructive. The other flashpoint will, of course, be Mexico for the reasons that Jorge has just suggested. But even there, I think I take a somewhat more optimistic view, partly because of NAFTA and partly for other reasons. We are now in a situation where there's very little that the United States can do to Mexico or about Mexico that would damage Mexico without causing considerable costs and harm to interest groups, to domestic interest groups. So if we impose constraints on immigration, and begin deporting people, the domestic economic as well as political consequences will be quite great. If we start building a wall, I mean, that just invites the Mexicans. If we build a fence, then the Mexicans, a Mexican entrepreneur will no doubt establish a factory right near the border to produce wire cutters that can get through the fence. And if he builds a 20-foot wall, another factory will go up producing 20-foot ladders. I mean, it's just silly. There's not very much that a wall would accomplish, and it seems to me that this is more symbolic than real. If he wants to negotiate NAFTA, or impose taxes on American enterprises in Mexico to force them to come back, the consequences here will be destructive, and job losses will occur simply because the major impact of NAFTA was to create net, according to the best study I've seen, about 200,000 extra jobs in the American economy. If you attack NAFTA, some of those jobs are going to disappear, and the production chains that link the Mexican economy to jobs in the United States will disappear along with them. So I guess I'm not so pessimistic as Jorge is. I think Mexico and Latin America in general, but Mexico in particular, has all kinds of levers that it can pull, some of which I've just mentioned, but others that could be quite damaging to the United States if there isn't some modus vivendi worked out between the new administration and the Mexican authorities. So that's my view. Arturo.
Thanks very much. I'd like to make a slight statement about my biography. I'm actually an academic. I spent 17 years teaching at Duke University, moved to Georgetown University, had been at Georgetown for 25 years, and I only took three times out of my life to actually go into the government of the United States. I was in the State Department with the Clinton administration, and I was given, through those exquisite logics of bureaucracies, the responsibility for the one country that I didn't really know very well in Latin America. In fact, I was going to work with AID to try to come up with some ideas on how they might promote democracy programs in various places. I had no intention of going to the Department of State, but my resume wound up at the White House personnel. The Clinton administration had a very, very small bench after 12 years of Republican rule, and when my CV got over to White House personnel, and I was traveling teaching that summer, and I suddenly get a call saying, the White House wants you to go to the State Department, And I said, okay, well, fine, I'll go to the State Department. You know, with the Clinton administration, I think I can take that. And the Cold War has ended. I'm more comfortable with working with the U.S. than I might have. And so I went over and I said, well, look, you know, I do know a lot about the Southern Cone. And they said, the only vacancy that we have right now is the relationship with Mexico. And so I thought, well, why not? Let's try that. And it was maybe one of the best things that's ever happened to me, because I really was put in charge of the relationship with Mexico at the time that we were actually looking at NAFTA, trying to see whether we could come up with the side agreements. I was involved in the negotiations of the side agreements. And then it was my responsibility, actually, with colleagues in the U.S. government to actually, I chaired the implementation of NAFTA side accords, and then later the implementation of NAFTA itself. When my term came up, you know, as a tenure professor, you're given 2 years leave of absence. When my term came up, the university said you can't stay another year, but then the peso crisis happened. And I asked for another year, and I got another year. Then in the second Clinton administration, I had no intention of going back. I was offered 4 or 5 positions. And finally they called me and said, well, how about coming over to the National Security Council at the White House? And that's when Jorge Castañeda went into the Fox government at that time. So I saw a transition in Mexico that was really kind of interesting from the White House point of view. And then finally, President Obama did ask me to become his Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. Again, I took 2 years leave of absence. The university said, okay, we'll make it up for you on your sabbaticals later. Anyway, that's just a disclaimer that I'm an academic, and that's why I want to put my academic hat on to start with the first comment that Jorge did, and we'll disagree, Jorge, on a bunch of stuff. And that is that, you know, Trump is going to really try to look to see how he can do what he can for his base, for the people who elected him. But let's remember one thing. This chap was elected likely by about 15% of the voting age population in the United States. Remember that 42% of the people didn't vote, 58% voted. Of the 58% who voted, more people vote for Hillary Clinton than voted for Donald Trump. No, only 2 other presidents in American history have had the same kind of popular vote deficit that Donald Trump has had. And if you then look at the 30% who voted for him, at least 15% or maybe more, 20% of those, that 30%, actually would have preferred another candidate. He never won in the primary, any primary, by over 50% of the vote. So he has the Republican establishment against. Now, why do I say this? This is a president that today has a voting popularity, president-elect, of 42%, when the outgoing president of the United States has a voting popularity of 57%. Now, this is the guy who's going to make America great again because this other guy didn't do it so well, but most American people disagree with that. So he starts out with a significant deficit in terms of the popularity of his own election. Why is that important? The United States is a country, because of its constitutional framework, of deep separation of powers and deep divisions of power. This is about local state authorities and so on and so forth, and a very, very strong separation of powers, which led my professor at Columbia, and I did my doctorate at Columbia, and Richard Neustadt, who was one of the great scholars of the American presidency, who then moved on to Harvard to found the Kennedy School at Harvard. And he writes still the best book, I think, on presidential power. And he says in Presidential Power, he says, poor President of the United States, he's nothing but a glorified clerk, because he has to go and receive ambassadors, see Girl Scouts at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, then catch a plane to a APEC meeting in someplace in Asia and something like that. So what really is presidential power, asks Neustadt. He says, presidential power is the power to persuade. And the power to persuade is directly proportional with the popularity of the president. So if the president does not have significant popularities, he's not going to be able to get people to sign on to his particular kind of agenda. He does not have a blank slate. Now, let me back off for a second and say, well, wait a minute. It's true that the Republicans now control not only the president, but the Senate and the Congress as well, and the House of Representatives as well, and have significant control of several of the most of the state legislatures. So there really is a possibility but there's not, you saw it in the campaign, there's not really significant consensus in the Republican Party that they want to give him a blank check. So I am not sure. Let me just end this observation by saying, Neustadt said this. He actually worked for President Truman. And the day after Eisenhower was elected president, Eisenhower was in the Oval Office at the presidential desk, and Truman says, poor Ike, he's going to come in to this Oval Office, he's going to sit at this desk, and he's going to say, do this, do that, do this, do that, and nobody is going to do anything. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. I think I'll move over to NAFTA now. There are things that the NAFTA is not a treaty. NAFTA is an agreement. And that's a very important thing. Now, US WTO commitments are treaty obligations, and those cannot be done by a president. But the NAFTA accords were done under trade promotion authority, therefore it doesn't have treaty obligations. And according to Article 20 of NAFTA, the President of the United States can basically announce that he's going to withdraw from NAFTA. And he can sort of give what is a 2-month period or something like that in order to do that. But, so what? What if he withdraws from NAFTA? The key is whether or not whether he withdraws from NAFTA, the key is whether or not he's actually able to put into place higher tariffs on Mexican goods, And Mexico does export a lot of stuff to the United States. But guess what? The United States exports more stuff to Mexico than Mexico exports to the United States. And 20% of all the exports from Mexico to the United States are made in the United States to start with. And 80% of all exports to the United States are intra-firm transfers. That is, transfers into companies in the United States. So to pick your point up, to end the NAFTA relationship with these extraordinary production chains and so on and so forth that are taking place would be nothing but shooting himself in the foot. And this president, who right now is really quite confused about the facts of a lot of these sorts of things, is certainly going to hear from the U.S. automobile industry and all kinds of places like that who are going to say, we are now one of the most competitive automobile industries on the planet because of the North American production chains. You disrupt these production chains and you're going to just simply throw out of work many more people. By the way, just go to the state of Ohio. What is the state of Ohio, which Hillary Clinton lost? Whatever it's 50% of the exports to the state of Ohio go to Mexico. And they are to go into goods that then come back into the United States to be part of this production change. Anyway, so it's going to be difficult for this chap to push back on NAFTA. Now, what can the Mexicans do? And I think, I agree with Jorge on that. They can't just sort of sit back and say, bueno, si quieren negociar, negociemos, perfecto. That's not what they really ought to do. They ought to say, okay, if you're going to come out on NAFTA, well, what are we going to do? We'll have to put our countervailing tariffs on it. So what about the state of Ohio? What does Ohio sell? Engine parts for airplanes. We want to see the 45% tariff on that if the President of the United States does 35% tariffs. By the way, he can't even do that because he would violate the WTO agreements, which are treaty obligations of the United States. So the constraints are enormous on this president who doesn't really know what he's doing and has president-elect and doesn't really have a clear idea of what the facts are. So this is really a work in progress, folks. And I guess I take up your first point right here. We don't really know what's going to happen, but the chances are for this guy to come in there and think because he's president of the United States, he's going to somehow be the chief of the world, he's got something to learn about how politics really works. You don't run a country as complex as the United States like you run your own real estate business. Let me see. Deportations, I agree with Jorge that could be complicated, but you've seen in the news all the sanctuary cities across the country are basically saying, and this is a really serious issue for many Republicans, should the federal government really be instructing a local police on what to do? This is really a federal issue. You can't on the one hand argue that we need to celebrate states' rights and support states' rights, which is one of the platforms that comes out of the Republican Party. On the other hand, sort of say that the federal authorities are going to be able to tell you what to do in terms of things like deporting these folks. And many of the people who were deported were criminal aliens. I don't want to get into the facts on that right now. The real issue is that the flows of immigration in the United States have gone down significantly. In fact, they're negative at this particular point. Let me see, what else could I add to this? What about Latin America? What about Latin America? We don't have a clue yet because the sub-cabinet people that would be doing the Latin America policy are just simply not there to be seen. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting is that the key core, fairly conservative group of people who worked with the second Bush administration and maybe even in the first Bush administration, bailed out of supporting Donald Trump. Roger Noriega resigned from the Republican Party and he registered as an independent. So the people who are backbenching in terms of Latin America policy are people we don't know who they are. Now, I tend to agree that Latin America will be of second priority, and maybe that's good. If it's of second priority, don't mess with us, right? Don't tread on us or whatever. Now, I do worry that there are some places that they're really, really in serious trouble, though. Venezuela is one place that is imploding as we talk today. It's a country that is not characterized by authoritarianism, but it's a country that's characterized by chaos at this particular point. And it may be one of the great defaults of history. Frankly, I'm more worried about the prospects for Mexico right now, not in terms of what might happen with trade, But with the whole business of what's happening with the financial situation, with the collapse of the peso, I was there in 1995 when the peso collapsed, and President Clinton had to come up with a support package for Mexico of $40 billion, including $20 billion that had never been used before by the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which the president could do. This president is not going to come to the rescue of Mexico if there's something like that. And mind you, the private sector alone in Mexico owes $90 billion debt, has a $90 billion debt in dollars that they have to pay back. So there's something could be really quite serious. I'll end with that because otherwise we want to come back and have more of a discussion. Thanks very much.
You want to, John, you have something to respond before I respond to both of you?
So I think
Ganging up on me here?
I think Arturo was right about the limited powers of the president. Someone once, I forget who it was, someone once suggested to me that if you take into account the deep government, that is the people that are running all of the key agencies and stay there for through many presidential terms, and you add on all the senators and congressmen that are in Washington for decades, the president begins to look a little bit like an assistant professor. And the other folks that are in the government, the senators and the congressmen and the people that run the agencies, they look a bit like the tenured professoriate. So the tenured professors watch the president and they indulge him and they do things if they're asked to, but more or less on forbearance because they know that there's going to be a turnover pretty soon. And I think Arturo is right that Donald Trump is just about to run into the tenured professors, and they are a formidable bunch in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope you're both right, but my doubts are somewhat aggravated by the fact that the people he has now appointed, practically the entire cabinet is now done.
Yeah.
I think there's still just USTR missing.
Yep.
But that's one of the appointments, I think, which was kind of clear from the beginning. This guy, Dan DeMico, is supposed to be more or less.
He's been vetted, but he hasn't been announced.
He hasn't been announced.
Yeah.
The people he has appointed seem to be relatively in line with most of what he said during the campaign. Mm-hmm. They're not, it's not that all of a sudden, he said he would, let's take the immigration question, be very tough on immigration, but he appoints an attorney general or a homeland security guy who are, in fact, very liberal, progressive people who, in fact, will not do those things because it's not in them. And so you could read the appointment of a very progressive attorney general or homeland security guy as that. No, the two guys are real tough cookies. They're hardballers. I mean, Kelly was head of Southcom for 3 or 4 years, and he was very, very adamant about all sorts of things, particularly drug trafficking. He was a very tough, certainly that's the recollection I have of him from having just met him once or twice. He was totally the opposite, for example, of someone like Jim Stavridis, who was his predecessor at Southcom, who was somebody like that. He's a Dean of Fletcher School of International Relations. Now, Kelly probably would not be a Dean of SIPA or Fletcher. The same is true for Sessions as the Department of Justice. I mean, this is the guy who's going to do a lot of drug policy and other things. The DEA is in the Justice Department. The FBI is in the Justice Department. A lot of the CBP is in Homeland Security. It's not in the Justice Department. But this is where a lot of these things are done. So I wonder. I mean, I would ask you rather. What do you think? Are his appointments in line with what he said, or are they not in line with what he said during the campaign? My sense is that they are in line.
But a number of them are so peculiar and have backgrounds that are so far from experience in government that it's very hard to tell whether these cabinet secretaries, some of them, are actually being appointed because they're expected to do something, or whether they're being appointed as a kind of sop to the part of the constituency that likes their views, but the agencies are actually going to be run by other people, by the sub-cabinet in each case. It looks like it's a kind of a coalition between bankers and generals, with the odd right-winger thrown in, which doesn't make for coherent government. I think there's a significant possibility that this government 6 months from now will look like a mess, unable to get appointments through Congress, unable to agree with Congress on a whole series of issues from fiscal policy to foreign policy. I think I think it's going to get really entertaining after January 20th.
In fact, it may get entertaining even, after that, but even sooner than we may think, because you're already having some of these appointments being questioned by some significant people within the Republican Party itself. Let's remember also that, this is a guy who he's not going to be able to snap his fingers and get essentially senators and congressmen who, as you said, are more like the tenured professors who've been around for a long time. Remember that in the American system, you could, if you're in Mexico, you ask anybody, okay, who's the head of the PRI? And they'll tell you, ¿quién es el presidente del PRI, and del PRD, del PAN, you ask most people here, who's the president of the Republican Party and who's the president of the Democratic Party? Very people, these parties at the central level are extraordinarily weak. Most of the money is raised directly by the candidates. In American politics, the senators and the congressmen are private political entrepreneurs. They're bound by a certain kind of discipline to a certain degree, but it's one that is not particularly ideologically driven at particular points. The Republican Party is going to have a really serious Tea Party problem. And they're going to have a Tea Party problem on the one hand, and then they're going to have a Trump problem on the other hand. And so I am not so sure that in fact you're going to be able to and I agree with you, these appointments are fairly deplorable, if I might use that word. But the truth of the matter is that some of these people also have no experience with dealing with complex political agents. Max Weber taught us a long time ago, in his classic essay on politics as a vocation. And Jorge knows this well because Jorge's a good politician. To be a good politician takes a tremendous amount of skill, and it's very, very different than running ExxonMobil. I can tell you that. It's very different than running ExxonMobil. And what is the State Department? The State Department is an organization that has 50,000 people working for it. The bureau that I headed, the Latin America Bureau, which is the second largest in the Department of State, has 500 people in Washington, and it has 8,000 people in the various different sorts of embassies throughout the Americas. That's a large organization, and they're in all kinds of different places. And these people, what do? Do they just sit around waiting for somebody to give them orders? No. They have rules, they have procedures, they have traditions, they have history, they have laws. I can tell you this, as assistant secretary, very often some people would say, we can't do this sort of thing. And you might want to try to push back on some sort of things, but you'll immediately run into maybe the L Bureau, which are the legal types, which will come down and tell you, you can't do this, that, or the other. A little bit, remember when Trump got a call from Taiwan? Everybody went, what's going on right here? Well, that's pretty serious stuff. It's going to happen to these cabinet officials as well. It's an enormous bureaucracy. These are people who've been schooled in what you might call the liberal international order that comes from World War II. And this president wants to push back on that liberal international order, and I think he's going to have a very hard time actually getting his way done.
Should we open it up, Jill, to questions if you would?
From here. We're opening the floor. I'm here just to look around and see if there are questions from the floor. There's one in the back there. I think someone might.
My name is Erica. I came a little late, so sorry. I'm sorry if I missed anything. I'm interested in effects on agricultural policy and immigration with the new administration in Mexico, and I'm wondering, I guess where you see the connections between those things and how you see that going over the next year and over the next 4 years.
On immigration?
On the effects of immigration policy on agriculture in this country? If you all know. If you don't,
So I
it's
guess this
okay.
is a question about the H-1B visas and temporary worker programs that bring large numbers of migrant workers from Mexico to the United States for seasonal work. It's very hard to know. Trump hasn't said anything about it. The number of visas that have been granted over the course of the Obama administration has increased something like 2.5 times, which is part of the reason why the net flow of Mexicans in and out of the country is close to zero now, since there are so many that are entering legally with temporary work visas. We have no idea whether Trump is going to end that or not, but if he listens to big agro-business, he will continue to increase the number of visas.
Let's remember that 1 million people cross the border between the United States and Mexico every day. Every day. That's still close to 400 million people that cross the border every year. It's one of the most dynamic economies in the world. And these are legal crossings that we're talking about. So a wall and all that kind of stuff just seems like a fanciful mistake.
Another question?
One question is, just to be a little optimistic, I understand, I'm no fan of Trump, but can we build a case for an upgrade on NAFTA? If we're going to renegotiate this, is there a case to read into it new things that could actually upgrade it and make it a better deal? Of course, you have to have Trump's support on it, which is weird, but being positive here.
Well, I mean, I certainly, would not mind adding things to it that were not included from the beginning. Up to a point, you remember, Arturo, this is what Fox tried to do initially with Bush and with Chrétien in Canada, which was to move from NAFTA towards some sort of North American economic community, or whatever you want to call it, with a series of things that did not exist in NAFTA for all sorts of reasons. From the very obvious, like immigration and energy, to somewhat more technical things like permanent or standing dispute resolution panels as opposed to ad hoc panels, and then including other changes like compensatory financing, social funds, social cohesion funds, infrastructure funds, et cetera, et cetera. That largely got nowhere, mainly because, by the way, the Canadians were the most hostile to it. But maybe today they're a little bit less so. The problem is we don't know, as both John and Arturo said, what Trump has in mind. If, for example, not leaving aside all of this, what he has or his people have in mind is some sort of way or some sort of salary negotiations within industries so that the gap narrows, and so that at the same time U.S. firms can continue to be competitive, but without paying the incredibly low wages that they pay in Mexico to Mexican salaried workers. That's a renegotiation, or whatever you want to call it, that I would be very happy with. And I think there's something along those lines probably should have been done a long time ago. But no one really knows what in the world he has in mind, except reducing the incentive for American companies to move jobs to Mexico.
He has, unfortunately, and this is where one despairs a little bit about the rather rank ignorance of, he has the conception that because NAFTA was signed, jobs went overseas and went specifically to Mexico. Of course, jobs went not just to Mexico, but to Vietnam and to China and to all kinds of places in the world. He also misses a key point, which everybody who studied this is sort of issue. Jobs have been lost in industrial America, not because of trade. Trade maybe accounts for less than 20% of job loss. The jobs have been lost because of productivity, because of innovation, because of robotics. We're all going to be replaced by that. Professors, someday we will sit here will wink at you and stuff like that. We'll be robots, and we'll be unemployed as well, right? Including the professoriate, right? The assistant professors will all be robots. But you know, those are the realities of this North America. And what he hopes to do is to go back to the autarkic America. That is the America of the 1950s, where the percentage of GNP of the United States was about 30%. And today, the percentage of GNP, that is in trade, the percentage of GNP in trade was about 30% or even less than 30%. And today, it's much, much more, of course, of that. We've benefited significantly from that. The other thing he doesn't seem to understand is that the prices in the United States, when you go to Walmart, when you can buy a jacket, when you can get a toaster for $19, you know, that also benefits people because the cost of living is so much lower because of globalization. Are we going to want to go back to buying a toaster that costs $350? I ask you, a toaster for $350?
Question all the way in the back. Just wait for the mic.
It's for Professor Castaneda. I was wondering if you could comment on Trump's effect on the domestic election in 2018 in Mexico, because I know he's obviously very unpopular in Mexico, and if you see his election changing the dynamics, like domestically within Mexico as well.
Yeah, I mean, that will certainly be a factor. I think that as things stand today, perhaps for the first time in recent Mexican history, the U.S. will be a key campaign issue. Not foreign policy, because it's not foreign, it's domestic. And that will change perhaps the dynamics of the campaign, because the different candidates will have to address the issue. I don't think that they'll be able to just say, well, we'll talk about that later, it's not important, people don't care, especially if some of these things do come to pass. But even if they don't come to pass, the rhetoric, I don't think, will go away. I don't see Trump not tweeting anymore about Mexico once a week at least. It doesn't make any sense to me for him to shut up. It's not going to happen. So in that sense, I think it will be a very important campaign issue. And then it will depend which way, you know, the Mexican electorate wants to take it. If the Mexican electorate wants to take it in the sense that, given, as someone said to me, or some friend of mine said today, that someone he knew in Brooklyn told him, look, if you guys, ustedes eligieron un loco, pues también nosotros vamos a elegir un loco, ¿y qué? And he was obviously referring to what he considers el loco de Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Well, you don't have to go that far, but there is that temptation. Say, all right, for somebody like Trump, we need a nationalist, passionate, rabble-rousing patriot who will defend us. The other possible conclusion the electorate could reach is we need, you know, for the first time since Salinas, in a way, a president who is more worldly than his predecessor, because it's been in constant decline since Salinas. Cedillo was less worldly than Salinas, Fox was less worldly than Cedillo, Calderón was less worldly than Fox, Peña is less worldly than Calderón, and the next guy, I mean, if you think the Peña people are like from New Jersey, wait until you see the next guys. If you like New Jersey and Toluca, you'll love Hidalgo or Tabasco.
I was just at the Feria Internacional del Libro, and that is that you want a president who writes books, not a president who doesn't know what book he may have read.
There was a question here? Yeah.
I think you're right. We don't know Trump, but we do know Peña Nieto, we do know Ruiz Massieu, and I think we can project how they will act against or with Trump. So my question is, what would you think they will do in a Trump presidency?
So the question is, what is the Mexican government likely to do, confronted with what the Mexican government has done so far is nothing. It said very little. It's indicated that it would be willing to discuss a modernization of the NAFTA treaty. It hasn't talked much about immigration. The wall never came up in the press conference when Trump was in Mexico City. So the Mexican authorities have been playing this very, very, very cautiously. Whether that serves the national interest is another question altogether.
I've heard, but as a rumor, that there's a group of the people around the president who are desperately trying to get a meeting with Trump before the inauguration, whereas there are others who seem to be more sensible and think that the conditions don't really exist. I mean, it would be very difficult to find a way for Peña to meet with him in a way that does not look like a part two of the meeting in Mexico City. Once the two are presidents, then they can meet the first time at some summit. They can meet the second time perhaps at the border or somewhere around there, and then establish the normal meetings, the Mexican going to Washington and the American coming to Mexico, which has been happening constantly now for the past few years, and it could become sort of normal. But I don't see very well how they can work out a pre-inauguration meeting. But certainly I know that there's a group of them that is trying to do this almost desperately. I think it would be a mistake, because you have to know what you're going to say before you have a meeting. You can't go to a meeting and wing it. It doesn't work that way, especially when Peña Nieto may have some political skills and virtues, but winging it is not one of them. This is not what he does best.
Although I would think that the position of the Mexicans is strongest in simply making the arguments that we discussed earlier, and that is that the extent to which there is, at this particular point, such a strong interconnectivity between the two countries, that anything that sort of unravels this sort of thing is very much against the interests of both countries. And then try to make a persuasive case of that, they can do that. They can do that. These are two countries that are so dependent on one another at this particular point that you can't unravel it.
Jorge wrote a column the other day, which I thought was very smart. It was a column in which he laid out a series of steps the Mexican government could take if it were to be confronted by a Trump that was aggressive and hostile. And they could include all kinds of things. California has now legalized marijuana. Maybe Mexico should. And so if you ship marijuana up the west coast to the California border, the Mexican authorities will not stop you now. So you create a kind of a drug flow into California where there's a great demand. You can think about a series of steps that you might take to make migrating to the United States easier. If not for Mexicans, who don't seem to want to go in such large numbers as in the past, you can simply make it easier for Central Americans to reach the northern border by providing them with decent transportation at low cost, protection against coyotes that are thieves and rapists. So it's another issue. You can imagine ways that you could make the fence or the border wall that's going to be created less effective than it might be otherwise. There are a series of steps. You could tax American enterprises that move out because Trump is taxing them if they don't. There are all kinds of measures that the Mexican authorities could take in response to Trump gestures, or just in order to make the point that Mexico is a sovereign country that has considerable leverage in the relationship. Did I leave something out?
Nope, we've got it just right.
And if you use your imagination, you could think of many more things that Mexico could do.
That's you, yeah.
Good evening, my name is Javier. I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit, the subject was already touched upon a bit, about the Mexican peso. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what could the Mexican government do in order to protect its citizens and its businesses with this crisis that's happening with the Mexican peso, especially considering now that the governor of the central bank, Carstens, has resigned.
I think they've been right so far in not, throwing money at the at the markets to try and sustain the peso at whatever, 20, let's say, just because it's a ballpark figure, 20 to the dollar, and throw money at the markets and try and keep it at 20. I think they've been intelligent in not doing that. They have raised interest rates, and they will continue to do so. They probably will raise interest rates again at the end of this week or early next week, because now what is adding up to be a 40% devaluation of the Mexican currency is beginning to pass through into prices. They were able to control that for almost a year now, but it's beginning to pass through. In car, everything that's imported. And it's a very open economy, and so at least everything that has to do with tradable goods, at some point, whatever depreciation of the currency you have will reflect itself in inflation and prices. They would like not to raise interest rates too much, but they are going to have to. They don't want to spend their the reserves on defending the peso, and I guess they're right, but it's one of those terrible alternatives that you have, because if you don't defend it and it goes to 25, who knows what's going to happen. So on that front, they're doing the best job they can, but they don't have a lot of options, as Arturo was saying. I mean, the financial situation is right now perhaps the weakest one of the Mexican government. And for example, if in late December or early January there were to be a major Venezuelan default, or if the Fed raises rates next week, I think is the next meeting of the Fed, the December meeting, if they raise rates here, this is going to be very, very complicated for Mexico. I mean, we're moving into an era of great financial instability, and with a logical tendency probably of people, the Mexican business community saying, look, while we figure out what's going to happen, we figure out if Valenzuela and Coatsworth are right or Castañeda's right, why don't we just take our money out and wait it out, and then we'll see.
That's the single most dangerous and serious issue.
Right.
And those of us who were involved, because I was very much involved with the peso crisis in 1995. And let's remember that the congressional leadership at the time said, we will support President Clinton on this. And they did not come through on that.
That's right.
Senator D'Amato was against it, all kinds of things, we're going to lose our money. And if President Clinton had to, in 20 minutes, I was involved in those meetings, in 20 minutes decided to use the Exchange Stabilization Fund for Mexico. But in retrospect, I'll tell you what the detonator was for the 1995 crisis. And those of you who are in the markets, it's to this point that Jorge just had, if the Mexicans start bailing out of Mexico, that's when you have to worry. It's when the Mexicans start selling their positions in Mexico and moving their money abroad. If there is a significant outflow, then the situation could be really serious. And it's stunning to me that nobody is talking about this.
Right. What precipitated the collapse of the peso in 1994 was capital flight.
Exactly.
And it could happen again. And it's especially likely to happen in a period of uncertainty in the United States.
And I think on this we would all agree, Trump is unlikely to do what Clinton did.
Right, he has a way to go.
I mean, he's not going to come out all of a sudden and fork up the money to prop up the peso. I don't think he's going to do that.
He might offer, in exchange for putting aside some of the money, to build the wall.
The wall or his hotels.
Although remember that one of the arguments that the Clinton administration made at the time, in fact, Larry Summers made it at the time he was the Undersecretary for International Affairs, before the D'Amato Committee and other things like that, is that if Mexico really goes, this could even affect Italy. So we're still, folks, in a very delicate international financial situation, where ironically this country has done better than most other countries, but there are really serious political and economic problems in other places in the world. So we cannot afford to have this kind of a crisis.
See one all the way in the back that I almost can't see.
Hello, my name is Camilo. Do you think that the demise of the TPP is good or bad for Mexico, and particularly its trade policy agenda?
The trade policy agenda of who?
Of Mexico, of securing more
TPP.
markets abroad, and particularly Guajardo's vision of TPP as pretty much literally the gold standard of Hillary Clinton.
Arturo will know more about this than I, but I think that TPP was not conceived, or at least was not likely to have major economic consequences for Mexico. It was positive in a minor way for both the United States and Mexico, but it was not going to be a huge deal. And it had perhaps more geopolitical significance than it had economic impact, or would have.
Perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, given the fact that the president-elect has been so vociferous about how he's going to push back on China. Because in fact, if there was a criticism among some of the signatories of the TPP, including the Latin American countries, was, wait a minute, this is a little bit not enough of a trade agreement. It's an agreement that has other geopolitical considerations. And indeed, the United States was concerned about that, and the TPP was an effort. Remember, China is not part of TPP, but TPP was an effort to actually pull together all of the countries of South Asia, particularly Southeastern Asia, into something that would have been a fairly smart geopolitical strategy on the part of the United States to try to see whether it could, in fact, contain China, given the... And so for him to come out against that at this particular point does in some ways contradict also his concern over China.
So the smart way to balance against China is something like is to balance against China without embracing Russia, or at least that's the strategy that the Obama administration has pursued. TPP was part of that strategy. If you abandon TPP and the strategy of building a community of interests among Pacific Ocean countries, then you're left with a different strategy toward Russia. That is, you have to balance against China in some other way, and the best way to do that may be, as Trump is arguing, to balance by embracing Russia.
There's a question right here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alejandro. I'm an MBA student here at NYU Stern. And the only thing that I can describe this is that it has been really sad that the Mexican government has not done anything to defend the Mexican people since the Trump campaign started. Mexicans have received a lot of critics. The trade agreement has been attacked a lot. And it is just sad that the government hasn't stand up to protect their people. And somehow we also have the mindset in many of the Mexican politicians that Mexico needs foreign direct investment from the United States to keep growing. So my question is, do you have any recommendation in the way Mexico should grow? And is there another way to pursue growth in our country instead of just relying on the United States growth?
Well, it's two differing points. I mean, also, we can see what John, who's the great economic historians of Mexican economic history, they have not done anything during the entire campaign. In other words, the government decided from the day that Trump announced his candidacy here up on Fifth Avenue, now a year and a half ago, the government made a pretty conscious and consistent decision, with maybe a little blip for a couple of weeks, not to say anything or do anything during the entire campaign, thinking first, he will never be the nominee. 2, he will never win the election. 3, he will never do what he said. And because they believed all of these things, they decided not to do anything. In addition, they also believe, because they are very priistas, they also believe that Mexico should not fool around in domestic US politics, because then the Americans will fool around in domestic Mexican politics, as if they didn't, first of all. And secondly, they didn't think that if you become a central issue of a campaign, like Mexico became a central issue of the campaign. I mean, this was a candidate who campaigned actively against the national interests of another country. You're allowed to do that, that's fine. I mean, if you think that's how you win an election, and he was right, you could do that. But What does the country that is the object of that campaign do in return? Well, if you do nothing, then you're in the worst of both possible worlds, because you're a central issue on the one hand, but you have no say in what happens or is being said on the other. And that's what happened to us, basically, and this is what Peña led us through this year and a half. Now, what can you do now? And coming to your point, I don't believe in this notion that this is an opportunity for Mexico to diversify away from North America. I just don't think that's doable. I don't think we really have any significant options elsewhere. The China card could be a geopolitical card. It is not an economic card. Our economies are too similar, other than the size, obviously, for us to be complementary. We are not a commodity exporter. We produce exactly 0 pounds of soybeans per year in Mexico. And we are running out of oil, and our copper mines are not productive or competitive. We are not a commodity exporter, for better or worse. We're not. We export manufacturers, which is what got Trump upset.
Except oil.
Except oil, but there's very little left, Arturo, that's not already locked into the U.S. because of deals that are made over the years and pipelines that are already laid. We export very little by sea. We're every week, every month, we have less crude oil to export. So our leeway of exporting oil to China, well, maybe we could do 50,000 barrels a day here, 50,000 barrels a day there. So I don't see the diversification issue as central. What I think what we have to do is find ways to have more integration with North America, not less. And there are things that can be done. I mean, someone mentioned a little while ago, what options? For example, one of the things people theoretically close to Trump have been saying is to raise what's called the North American content in the North American automobile industry. Right now, I think it's at 65%. In other words, for a car made in Mexico to enter the US without duties, 65% of it has to have been manufactured in one of the 3 countries or all of the 3 countries of North America. You could raise that to 80, and then there would be more jobs in North America. Where in North America we can argue about later, but there would be more because a greater part of the car would be made here. That's something that could be positive. I don't know how the Japanese and the Europeans and the Germans who have invested in Mexico on the basis of 65% would like that. Maybe they wouldn't. But at least, there are things there that we can do. But if we think this notion, for example, now, you hear it every day in Mexico, the domestic market, the domestic market, the domestic market. I agree completely that wages in Mexico are pitiful. They're embarrassing. They're a shame. And obviously, domestic demand should be stimulated in many, many ways, including, obviously, wages. But we have a tremendously open economy. 65% foreign trade is 65% of GDP in Mexico. If you increase domestic demand, you know where it's going to go to. It's not going to go to Mexican suppliers because there's no such thing. It's going to go to imported goods. Walmart is going to sell more stuff. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you're going to have a problem in your balance of payments right away if you start, stimulating Mexican demand and domestic market.
Questions? We're going to go all the way in the back, and then I'll come to you afterwards.
Hi, so you guys really haven't talked too much about the Caribbean and South America besides Venezuela. So what about South America and the Caribbean? My very smart friend who's sitting right here, who couldn't find a seat, said if Mexico's relative power in Latin America is defined by partly its access to the US, and maybe Trump will mean that there's less access to the US, would that mean that Brazil and South America will actually gain relative power in sort of the Latin American realm? So what are your thoughts on South America and the Caribbean with the Trump presidency?
Well, if you look around Latin America and you're trying to find leadership in countries that are well run, decently managed, and can exert through economic and other means an influence on the surrounding nations, you'd be hard pressed to find a country that's in that position. Chilean politics is in a mess, and Chile is too small to have much influence. Macri in Argentina is having difficulties because the Peronist opposition is so powerful. In Brazil, the entire political class is on its way to jail. We don't know who's going to end up running the country after that. Venezuela is in crisis. Colombia has just put together a peace deal and is perhaps the best candidate for some leadership in South America. But this is a region in which countries countries consult with each other, but they don't easily cede leadership to any of their members. So my sense is that the absence of American active diplomacy in the region will not result in some formation of a détente or an entente that will be led by a single country in Latin America, but rather quite the opposite. Latin American countries will go their own ways, and they'll consult and deal where they can, and as it suits their interest. Is that an answer to your question?
Sure. How do you feel about Trump's presidency in South America and the Caribbean?
Well, I think what I said earlier is nobody on this panel knows what it's going to mean. If the U.S. government is in disarray within 6 months and continues to be a mess for 4 years, that could be bad or good for Latin America. But in either case, I don't think anybody in the Trump administration is going to pay much attention to any part of Latin America other than maybe Cuba, maybe certainly Mexico, perhaps some issues that come up in the Caribbean. But South America is not likely to be to get much attention in the Trump White House, and that could be a good thing.
I had a question.
Good evening, my name is Rafael. My question is mainly for Professor Castañeda. Do you think that the fact that Peña Nieto invited Trump a few months ago will benefit the negotiation, or it was just a desperate action against the Trump campaign?
I think it was a huge mistake to have invited him the way he did, because they weren't ready to respond to him. They didn't have a Clinton visit locked in, which would have helped. And they didn't do what would have made a lot more sense, which is what Netanyahu did here and what Sisi from Egypt did here, which is in the in the context of the UN General Assembly. Peña came, you meet with Trump and Clinton at the UN or at their hotel or at their whatever, and you make sure you do both things. And you don't do it in the presidential palace, and you don't make him look presidential. You do it like Netanyahu did it. Yeah, well, Netanyahu's Israel. Well, Peña's Mexico. I mean, you know, Israel's very important to the United States. Yeah, but Mexico is too. So we could have done that. They didn't do that. I think it was a huge mistake. Now, once they did that, right now they're trying to sort of catch up and say, well, at least we were right. We got it right. Well, no. First of all, I think they did help Trump. I think that was a point of inflection in his campaign. He started going up after the visit, and he used it systematically, showing, you know, I'm treated like a president by a president of an important country. Secondly, I think it got them nothing in exchange. The peso has collapsed more than any other currency against the dollar since the elections. They so far, they didn't get the first meeting with Trump. Abe of Japan got it. That's a fact. Well, yeah, but we were the first ones to meet with Trump. It's not true. And I'm not even sure they'll get any meeting with Trump. I'm not sure they should, but I know they want to. I don't think they'll get that either. So I think it was a total disaster from every point of view. And I guess the best proof that it was a total disaster is that the guy responsible for it was fired. I mean, you don't fire guys for doing something successful. Not even Trump does that, right? Right. He fires the guys who lose, right? You're fired. I think that'll be the one last one
This
here.
might be our last question.
Hi, I would like to ask, what is a positive sign you see between the relation of Mexico and the rest of Latin America with Trump's win? Like, do you think it's going to make their economic alliance better, or I don't know, any thoughts or predictions?
I think partly because of NAFTA and partly for other reasons. Mexico is now much more a part of North America than it is of Latin America, and that's not going to change. If you look at Mexico's trade flows, its investment patterns, it really is focused on the US and Canada, but mostly on the US. There's very little Mexican investment elsewhere. Some niche opportunities, for example, Mexicans have invested in Cuba from time to time because there's not US competition there. If you look at the Mexican economy, it's tied to North America, and there's very little in the terms of trade flows and investment that links Latin America, links Mexico to South America particularly. Maybe to some parts of Central America and the Caribbean, but Mexico is really a part of the North American orbit, and I think it will remain so. Yeah.
I think, if I might just add one comment on this, there's a lot of disquiet, not only in Mexico, but all through the region about the presidency of the United States. You know, the relationship between the United States and Latin America is very different now. I think President Obama made a real effort to try to get away from the sort of unilateralism that existed before. The efforts that his administration, and I was very much a part of this, did to try to open up a different narrative with Cuba and so on, is something that could very well be reversed, and a lot of people in the region are not happy about that. However, let me just end on a fairly positive note for the region. This is a difficult time because of some of the things that John referred to, you know, the crisis in Brazil, the lack of strong support in the Congresses for several presidents, you know, PPK is running into trouble now in Peru, Macri is at the same time. So, you know, there are serious issues. 19 presidents now, after Dilma had to step down in Latin America, have not finished their terms in this period of so-called post-Cold War democratization. So there are crises still there in terms of consolidating institutions. But having said that, I'm really bullish on the Americas. I think the Americas really are a continent that's coming forward. Many of the problems that we're facing today is this new, essentially middle class, lower middle classes, you know, absolute poverty levels that we saw not that long ago have disappeared. And let's remember that, you know, from 1930 until 1980, 45% of all changes of government were through military coups. You know, since the 1985, 1990, since the end of the Cold War, there have probably been 2 classic coups, despite all these presidents that didn't finish. That was Honduras and Haiti. And, you know, despite the problems that Brazil is facing today, you know, if out of this you get the consolidation of the rule of law, that's a really good thing. And let me just end with one thing. The Americas is the only continent in the world today where irredentist politics is not an issue. Irredentist politics is when subalternate loyalties, essentially, and I hate to use this word, trump the collective loyalties. And that has to do with ethnic divisions, with religious divisions, with geographic divisions, and so on, that are even coming up to fore in Europe. The Americas is the continent of the longest lasting independent nation states. When the UN was formed in 1947, how many signatories were there? 52. How many were from Latin America? 22. You know, the 193 nations that exist today is a essentially Cold War phenomena, and Latin America stands in a very good position because it doesn't have these fundamental, you know, wrenching conflicts that we see across the world in the 21st century.
Well, on that note, that wonderful positive note, I think we are going to conclude, and I ask you to keep an eye out for future events. But for today, to please join me in thanking our 3 guests for their time with us.